Good morning, ladies. Oh, probably good afternoon by the time you're seeing this narrated PowerPoint, which I'm assuming you will be taking a look at on Monday during the double. I've already sent you one on exploring break-even briefly, but I'm going to go through some more detail on different ways in which you can calculate break-even and give some examples too. And I'll put this new presentation onto the files tab under on the Teams piece of software, okay? Piece of software, you know what I mean, the Teams channel. So we're going to look at break-even analysis. Then we talked very briefly about the way in which you can calculate break-even using a formula. We're also going to have a look at the way in which you can use a graphical representation to calculate break-even too. So without further ado, let's crack on. So in terms of what break-even analysis is, that's basically what it is. Now, again, some of this will be a little bit repetitive, but it's quite an important concept to get your head around, and some students find it a little difficult to understand break-even, so I'm going to try and give you a bit of chance to do that, okay? So basically what we're trying to do is calculate when a business is earning enough sales revenue to pay all of its costs, so it's not making a profit, but it's not recording a loss either, and a good way to remember it is basically break-even is where total revenue equals total cost, okay? So we talked briefly about contribution too and how important that is, and that's basically where we're looking at how each individual product or activity is helping to make a profit. And contribution and the way in which you can calculate contribution, either total contribution or contribution per unit, is quite an important one to get your head around. And again, we'll look at a couple of ways in which we can do that in a minute. It's not the same as profit, okay? Because when we're talking about contribution, we've not taken into account fixed costs, okay? So we're only really, remember when we talked about contribution, it's the difference between selling price per unit and the different and variable cost per unit. So we haven't considered fixed costs. As a result of that, contribution is not profit, okay? And another way of thinking about that and to show it is to look at this here. So a sales revenue, take away your variable costs equals your contribution, but we've got to take away fixed costs before we can actually calculate our profit, okay? So again, same problem as normal, keep getting in the way. Let's go over here a minute, see if that makes it any easier, so I don't have to keep moving around. So contribution per unit then. We've talked about that again. It's a sale of a single product, and we calculate the contribution by taking the amount per unit that we sell and how much our revenue is higher than our variable cost. Okay, and that we can use that to then calculate, in this case, our contribution per unit. Selling price per unit, as I mentioned, take away our variable cost per unit. Now, if we can calculate the contribution per unit, we can use that to calculate break-even, as we talked about before. And total contribution, though, if we know what our contribution per unit is and the total number of units sold, we can calculate our total contribution. And that obviously can then be used to calculate profit. So if we've actually calculated our total contribution, so we've taken our contribution per unit and we times it by the number of units that we've sold, our total contribution, if we then take away our fixed costs, if our total contribution is higher than our fixed cost, we've achieved a profit, okay? So it can be used to calculate profit too. There's a task there I'd like you to take a quick look at, okay? And again, I'm going to give you some time to consider that. There are a range of different items there. There's in this case is Mike is a tree surgeon, and there is some costs. It tells us a little bit about what his total variable costs are and what his fixed costs are. So you should be able to calculate the contribution per unit and also the total contribution for the year. So have a go at that question, and then we'll revisit it once you've had a go at that. Okay. So in this situation then, basically the way in which we would calculate our contribution per unit is we would take our selling price, in this case it's 950 quid, that's what we've been saying our average customer will be, and in this case, to actually calculate our variable cost per unit, we're going to need to take a total variable cost of 110,000, divide it by, in this case, 200 customers to give figure. Okay, so when we calculate that, that gives us a contribution per unit of £400. Now, in this instance, where we've got our contribution per unit at £400, we can times that by 200, which is the total number of consumers or customers, and see the total contribution that we're making, which in this case would be £80,000. Typical exam question. This comes from a business paper rather than an economics paper, but again, it's quite useful to see the way in which in some cases questions are being asked. So total contribution for the first 80 customers who wanted Steve to customise their cars. Again, should be able to calculate that from the information you've been given. You've got your fixed costs, you've got your average variable cost, and you've got your average spend or revenue per customer. So again, have a go at that question, see if you can understand and come up with the solution. Okay, in this instance then, taking a look at the solution, we're talking about £440 as our selling price. We're taking away 160, which is our average variable cost. That gives us £280 contribution per unit. We've sold 80 to the first 80 customers, so our total contribution would be £22,400. Other examples that you can take a look at. Okay, so in this instance, I think on the very first slide there was a link to the Restaurant Man, which actually talks about 7-bone as a concept. So it's something you can go and take a look at if you choose to. But in this instance, again, we've been given all the information we need. We've got our average customer spend, we've got our variable costs, we've got our fixed costs, and we can also work out how many customers that we're going to have in our first week of trading. So that gives you all the information. You should be able to then calculate the total contribution from 7-bone's first week of trading. Okay, so our contribution per unit would be 10, take away 4, which is our average cost, and that is going to leave contribution per unit at £6. Okay, our total contribution though is going to be based on that £6 times, in this case, 6 days a week, 60 covers per day. So our total contribution is going to be 2,160. Now the profit in that situation then is if we've now got our total contribution, and remember, if we take our fixed costs away from that total contribution, we can calculate a new profit figure. So in this instance, for the first week of trading, 7-bone would, on that basis, have made £660 profit after considering all of their costs and taking those total costs away from total revenue. Things to remember about contribution per unit then. Okay, obviously, if everything else is staying equal, then if we can increase our selling price, raise our selling price, then clearly our contribution per unit is going to increase too. It could also be increased, contribution per unit could be increased by reducing our variable cost per unit. If we could renegotiate raw materials or some element of variable cost, that might mean that we can actually increase our contribution per unit. Not the same as profit, that's an important one to remember. It's not the same as profit per unit because when we calculate contribution per unit, we haven't considered fixed costs. We haven't considered all costs, and so it's not the same as profit. And clearly, if we can increase the contribution per unit, that increases the potential profit that a business can make, provided it can sell the number that it needs to sell to break even and then go on to make profit. Okay, so in terms of calculating break-even output then, basically the information that you would need is the selling price of the product, the variable price of producing that single unit, and the fixed costs associated with that product, okay? And those are the ones that in the short term do not vary with output. The fixed costs stay the same, so things like rent or insurance or something similar. Now to calculate the break-even output, and it's something that we have looked at. I don't think we've necessarily looked at it as a formula, but that's the formula that you can use. So your break-even output will equal your fixed costs divided by your contribution per unit. So in this instance then, if Mike wants to break even, and this is obviously based on the info that we had from the previous slide. We've got £48,000 worth of fixed cost. We've got a contribution per unit of 400, so we'd need 120 customers to buy our services in order to break even. So if we take the example of a 7 bone and what they would need to break even, remember in this instance we had basically £1,500 as our fixed cost. We had £6 contribution per unit based on what we'd worked out previously. So we would need 250 customers to break even. That would be our break even number of units. Very important that you don't just put 250. Say what it is, 250 customers per unit, or 250 units of a particular product or whatever, so that you're giving the unit some sort of meaning. Okay. Other examples which I'm going to leave you to take a look at. Okay, so another example here of a business that's got a fixed cost of £500 per week, a contribution of 250. How many customers each week will it need to break even? Pretty straightforward, that one, isn't it? Okay, so 2 customers, that's £500 fixed cost divided by our contribution per customer. So we'd need 2 customers in order for that to work out. Okay. In this instance, we've got a petrol station that's buying petrol at 93p per litre. Selling price is 99p. Weekly fixed cost of 1,200. How much does the petrol station need to sell to break even? In this instance, that would be 20,000 litres, okay, because we've got £1,200 as our fixed cost. We've got a contribution, basically, per unit of 6 pence, okay. So then, essentially, if we divide 1,200 by 6 to calculate the amount of units that we would need, it would be 20,000 litres that we would need to sell in order to break even. If in the third example, we've got a situation where we've got the petrol station owner who's been able to negotiate lower fixed costs, and those are reduced by a small amount to 1,140. What would that do to the break-even level of output? Well, in this instance, it would reduce it by a whole 1,000 litres. Okay, so effectively, we've now got our fixed costs of 1,140. We've still got the same contribution per unit of 6 pence, but in this instance, to break even, we would only need to sell 19,000 litres of petrol in that particular week. Okay, so in terms of the reasons why you might use break-even output, it's a really good way of checking to see whether a new business proposal might be viable, okay? So that's one of the main reasons for doing it. And if you think about it, if you've been able to calculate reasonably accurately your fixed costs, your variable costs, your selling price, and a range of other things to actually arrive at that, one could argue that you've actually done a significant amount of homework and have thought about it quite seriously. So if you were thinking about trying to raise money for a business, then that clearly would demonstrate that you're planning to run your business in a fairly efficient way. Okay, doesn't necessarily guarantee profitability or future success, but it can be a really good indicator of whether the entrepreneur and the bank might be likely to consider financing the business based on the costs that they've actually already try to find out, and also the number of customers that might be needed or would be required to break even. Is that going to be feasible? It creates a ballpark figure and also demonstrates if you've got break-even analysis in a proposal, in a business proposal of some description, that you can try to consider some of the key important factors within a business success. So let's take a look then at the next way in which we can interpret break-even or create a break-even scenario. Now, we've looked at formulas, and there's nothing wrong with using the formulas as we've explained in both this and the last presentation, but I also want to show you the way in which you can use graphs to actually do the same thing. So in this case, we've got this information, we've been provided with this information, okay? So at your fill, I've got weekly fixed costs of 2,800, their variable cost per customer is £3, their average revenue earned per customer is £10, and then the maximum weekly number of customers, the capacity they have is 600. Okay, so that gives you a lot of information, well, a reasonable amount of information about this particular organisation. Now, in terms of how we then can put together a break-even chart to help us to decide whether this is going to work for us or not, or what the break-even value is going to be, the number of units, this is the way in which we might go about it. Okay, so here's an example of a break-even chart. It's not been filled in yet, okay, but this is our eat-your fill break-even chart. We've got cost and revenue down the vertical axis, and that ranges from 0 up to £6,000. And then we got the number of customers from 0 again to 600. Okay. Now, what we're going to do is basically plot all of the information that we've been given and show this on a break-even chart. So I'm just going to build this up step by step. As you can see, the first thing we're going to draw in is our fixed cost line. Okay. We've been told that figure is, if we go back one, 2,800, as you can see there. So 2,800 is our weekly fixed cost. If it's a fixed cost, we know that's not going to change with output. So we know that that's going to be a horizontal line. So we draw in a horizontal line at 2,800 and label it fixed cost. Next thing you're going to do is we're going to bring our total cost line in. Okay, now remember, total cost is basically fixed cost plus variable cost. So we're going to need to calculate what our variable costs are and how that might work out. Okay, so in this instance, if we go again, we just jump back one again and look at our variable cost per customer. That's £3 per customer. Now that clearly we need to allow for to calculate our total cost. So in this case, if we actually draw in our fixed cost line and then draw in our total cost line, basically we start that total cost line from where the fixed cost line has actually been drawn in, because clearly to calculate our costs, our total costs, we need to know both our variable cost and our fixed costs in order to calculate total costs. So for each time that we actually look at this, so effectively as we start to increase the number of customers, then clearly each of those customers have a variable cost of £3. So that the difference between our fixed cost and our variable cost line is £3 per customer each time round. So you can see that at 600 units, which is our total output, we are at a figure of 4,000. Just trying to calculate it myself. 4,600. Okay, so that's £2,800 worth of fixed cost and £3 per unit variable cost. 600 units has £1,800 worth of variable cost to create our total cost line. Okay. Now the next thing we're going to do then is to draw in our sales revenue. Okay. Now our sales revenue, let's just flick back again, is basically £10 per customer. Okay, so average revenue earned by our per customer is £10. So you should be able to see and should be able to calculate when we do this. If we're talking about how we calculate our revenue line, okay, at 600 units, we've said it's £10 per item. We know that that sales revenue figure is going to be £6,000. So there's the point at which we would actually finish our line. And in this case, if we sell nothing, if we sold nothing, then basically we're going to start our revenue line at 0. Okay, so in this instance, if we draw that line in, we've now got our sales revenue line drawn in, and you should be able to see that at this point there is a point at which we have both total costs and sales revenue at the same point, which is at 400 units. Okay, now remember we've said that the break-even output is basically where total cost and total revenue are one of the same, and that is the point at which we have reached there. So let's take a look at drawing this in then. Okay, so the break-even point we've actually now labelled. We've labelled our total cost, our sales revenue, and our fixed cost, and also our break-even output. We can read off from here that basically we would need 400 units to break even, and it would also tell us how much sales revenue we would be generating, okay, at that point, because if we draw across to here, £4,000 is what we would be generating. Another way in which we could check that is 400, and we know there's 400 customers, and they've each paid £10. So again, that £4,000 is our break-even revenue too. Okay, so that's basically the way in which you can calculate using a break-even chart what your break-even units and revenue level it should be. Okay, so if we just draw that in and show in this case that in this instance, okay, so where we're talking about the next thing in that we talked about previously, let's just go back one for a minute. So that's our break-even point, okay? So if we've achieved, in this case, 400 units of output, we have broken even. Okay, let's assume though in the real world we've actually managed to do better than that. We've actually managed to get to 500 units. So we've actually produced 500 units worth of sales, and in this instance you can see that we are into a situation where break even was at 400. Actual output and actual sales was at 500 units. So in this case, we have a margin of safety. The difference between our break-even point and our actual output. So it's 100 units. So in this case, our margin of safety would be 100 units. Okay, now also you can see that in this scenario, we've got to a position where at 500 units, we've actually started to get to a point where sales revenue has actually exceeded total cost. And so wherever we've got to a situation where we've got to break even point and then we're selling more over and above that, we are into achieving a profit. Now in this instance, we can see that this is £700. That's a profit of £700. And that can be calculated in a number of different ways. We know that at our total cost at this level here, at 500, is, roughly speaking, going to be something in the region of 4,300. May not be absolutely accurate, but that suggests that it is 4,300. So in this instance, we can see the difference between 4,300 and 5,000, which is the sales revenue we've achieved at 500 units, is the profit of £700. Okay, so margin of safety, quite an important principle. It's the difference between actual output and break-even output. Okay, so hopefully that makes a bit more sense for you. Let's have a look then at the effect of changes in costs and price on the break-even point then, okay? So here are a few examples. Again, I'm just going to run through these. I'll obviously leave you the presentation to take a look at your leisure. But in this instance, let's take a look then. So we've got a certain scenario as we talked about before. Selling price is £5, or is £5. Variable costs per unit are £3, and our fixed costs are £1,000. So we can calculate our contribution per unit. Difference between selling price and variable cost per unit of 5 minus 3 equals £2, and our break-even point we can calculate based on the fact that we've got £1,000 worth of fixed costs. We're going to divide that by our contribution per unit of £2, so we need 500 units. In this scenario, we need to sell 500 units to break even. Okay, let's take a look then at what might happen if we made some changes to those numbers then. So if we said in this case that we had a higher selling price, okay, so the change in the business environment means we can sell for a higher price. That means we can sell at £6, okay. Our variable cost per unit is still the same, but our contribution per unit goes up to £3, okay. In that case, clearly our break-even unit, the effect on break-even output would go down, okay. So 1,000 divided by, in this case, £3 per unit contribution would be 334 units, okay? And there's a range of different options that you can take a look at. Lowering selling price, again, reducing, in this case, the contribution per unit, so it goes down, in this case, to £1. Then we divide that by our fixed costs, and we need to then produce 1,000 units. So there's a range of different options that you can see that changing one of the variables clearly is going to have an effect on both the contribution per unit and also the break-even quantities that we might need to achieve in order to be successful. Okay, some of the strengths of break-even then. Okay, it can be very good. It certainly focuses the entrepreneur on how long it's going to take before a startup reaches profitability. So it also means that he or she will know what output or total sales are required. It's simple and straightforward. It's quite easy to use, and also it's a very, very good tool to set targets with for your sales teams or whatever. Margins of safety calculations can be used to see whether your sales forecasts are going to be over optimistic before you start incurring losses. You can also use it to show best case and worst case scenarios. So maybe help to consider the level of risk involved and say, well, we think this is going to be the case, but worst case scenario could be this, and this would demonstrate. We could show another set of break-even figures to show each one. Clearly, it also shows that if you can understand the principle of keeping your costs low when you're starting up, keeping them to a minimum, you've got a better chance of breaking even, because clearly if you've got higher fixed costs, then you've got to achieve a higher break-even output. So keeping your costs tight as you can without sacrificing quality is clearly quite important, okay? And again, it allows you to ask these what-if questions, okay? What if we changed to different price levels? What about if fixed costs or variable costs were different? And it could demonstrate that, number one, you understand the process quite well, and it might well persuade individual institutions, financial institutions, to lend you some money in order to start your business or to help support your business. Some of the weaknesses can be a bit unrealistic. Products sometimes aren't actually sold at exactly the same price at different levels of output, and fixed costs can also change. Sales are very unlikely to be exactly the same as output. Some output is likely to remain unsold. This doesn't allow, break-even doesn't allow for you to be able to do that. You might need to make some allowances and consider break-even as a help, but not necessarily the absolute panacea for giving you the answers. Variable costs are not always going to stay the same. If we get output rising, we might be able to buy inputs at lower prices, and that would clearly reduce variable cost per unit. So the theoretical principle of the variable cost and your fixed cost being relatively stable for a while, that may not be an unrealistic assumption. More often than not, you're going to get situations where selling prices may change as products are sold or not. And again, some of the things that might happen in reality may not necessarily work when we're starting to try to use break-even. And clearly, in this case, break-even analysis should be used as a planning aid rather than an absolute 100% decision-making tool. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there. There is a case study that you can take a look at. It's quite a tricky case study, that one, but if you do want to have a go at it, you're very welcome to. As much as anything, it's just showing you the way in which in some instances you might get asked a question about break-even. So there'll be some narrative that you might get an example of a break-even chart provided for you, and then you might have to work out some answers to those questions. And the questions in this instance were given there. So if that's something you want to take a look at, please by all means do. So this was really designed to give you a bit more of a flavour of break-even. Quite a few students struggle a little bit with break-even analysis, and giving you the alternative, not just of doing it via the formula, which is to do with contribution per unit and fixed costs, and calculating those in order to then show the break-even units, but also showing that you can do it using a graphical process too. Okay, so thanks very much for listening once again, and I'll catch up with you soon.